Hi, everyone. Us here from Ishmael Interactive would like to continue our interview series where we talk to people who are really just passionate and knowledgeable about what they do, and we find the customer experience in it. Today, here, I am joined by Maria Alberto. Maria, can you introduce yourself and why we invited you here?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Aaron. Hi, everyone. My name is Maria K. Alberto. My pronouns are she, her. I just finished my doctorate, my PhD in English at the University of Utah. And today I'm wearing a black t-shirt with the Comic-Con logo, and I need to brush my hair, but I'm very excited to be here.
Excellent. And as always, I am your host, Aaron Myers. I am a middle aged, heavyset Latino man with a gray beard, and I also need to brush my hair. My pronouns are he, him. So, Maria, let's get right into it. I invited you here because you are an expert in canon, which is, no, own it, own it. You're a
Own it. I was
PhD,
making
it
a
doesn't
face.
get more expert than that,
Right.
but you are an expert, and that is basically the truth behind stories or what is accepted truth.
hmm
And in this day and age, with customer experience and multiple perspectives and AI, truth is hard. So, what is canon and why does it matter to you? I know I'm not starting off with small questions here.
Yeah, that is about the biggest version that we could start with. So I love that. Let's take big swings and look for big answers. Um, so in my work, I was really interested about the way that the term canon has now the use of it has changed, right? So initially you had this term meaning something like this is the established body of literature. You've got to have read these great books. You got to know this art, whatever, or you don't count as a professor, as a student of literature, as an artist, whatever. Canon could also mean like a standard by which something was judged, right? And so you see that term come up a lot on like the academic side, right? There were like the canon wars of American higher ed. Like, who can we teach? Is it the old dead white guys? Is it everybody, right?
Right.
You also had like entire schools of thought being like, does it matter that there's one, great canon or not? But the shift that I'm really interested in is that now we have audiences, we have fans, and we even have like media producers outside the academy using the same term to mean something different, not um, the great works of a genre, but instead the truth about their fictional world. What is canon in Middle Earth or what is canon in a galaxy far, far away means, and I'm doing heavy scare quotes here, what really happened in the world of Star Wars or in the world of Tolkien's Middle Earth. And so I'm really interested in that shift because, as you put it, Aaron, it's a preoccupation with truth that fascinates me because it's both applied to fiction and it's coming up in our particular moment. Yeah.
I love that. I love the trace of what are the big works to
hmm
shifting universes. I think it might be because now we tend to enjoy things in mass. So 100
hmm
people watch something. What is the 80% they can agree on? But
hmm
something I see a lot when it comes to canon is because it's told to a specific group now, it gets
hmm
reinvented and retold. So
For sure.
you have nothing new under the sun. You get these stories that kind of get repeated. I don't know how many times I've seen Uncle Ben killed in a movie of Spider-Man. You know,
Yeah.
Batman's poor parents must always die, stuff like that.
hmm hmm
But
Sherlock. Yeah.
yeah, and we also see this a lot with service design. We have these consistent models, whether it's concierge, self-service, subscription.
hmm
It's new tech, new resources, new window dressing, same pattern.
hmm
So when you're looking at the patterns of a retold story, how do you separate what is core from what is reinventable?
Okay, I know you said you opened with the big question, but that's also a huge question. If I
Yes.
could like figure out, if you and I could figure out the answer to that, we'd be millionaires tomorrow, right?
Right.
Um, so it's a great question, and I'll give you the answer that I've seen proffered the most, right? I'm not necessarily subscribing to it myself, but I think there's some credence to it, which is that at least for these media franchises, knowing the difference between what is core to the pattern and what is reinventable is a deep familiarity with the franchise itself, right? So someone who's coming in and has not read a bunch of Spider-Man comics and it's like, oh, Uncle Ben died. Maybe people hate that. Maybe that's a really sad thing that we can reinvent. Someone who's been reading Spider-Man in like the four strip Sunday funnies for years. Hello, it's me. It's like, yeah, it's like, no, 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 no. This is not Spider-Man without that kind of establishing story.
Right.
If you're going to mess around with the death of Uncle Ben, A, you better have a good reason for it, and B, what are you going to do about the payoff that we got from it the first time around? So, to kind of summarize that, one answer to this question would be a deep familiarity with the pattern itself and what the narrative payoffs of those moments were in the original version, right? Um, the death of Uncle Ben is sad, but it's hard to see how we get the hero of Spider-Man without that kind of initiating moment. The difficulty, of course, with this is that sometimes, and I started saying Sherlock earlier because BBC Sherlock and anyway, those two, Moffat and Gatiss, are one of my particular sticking points because that's an example of what some scholars have called the fanboy auteur. In other words, someone who is like, I know my franchise so damn well. I know the ins and the outs of it. And therefore, that deep-seated familiarity and that emotional attachment and investment mean that I can fuck around with canon because I know it so well. And I'm like, no, no,
That's
no, 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 no.
dangerous.
That's that's
That's very
so
dangerous.
dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I say familiarity at the same time as like it's been established. That's not it. Like that's not the secret sauce by itself. So
Yeah.
shrug.
I think you see that happen sometimes in program development when you have,
Hmm.
an engineer who's been managing something for 20 years.
Hmm.
And because they have that sense of ownership, they make a really great new tool for engineers. But
Hmm.
my mom in a retirement home in Georgia has to use it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
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 It's that you're too invested in your own perspective.
And also like a disconnect between the end user and like the designer, or I'm thinking of a lot of point of sale systems. You can tell the
Yeah.
person who designed it was never a barista or a cashier or what have you,
Yes.
because
Yeah.
like, oh no,
Very
I would
true.
never have used this.
Very true.
Yeah.
So another thing that I see, because we're talking franchises over time, and I want to put it
Hmm.
on a timeline and adapt the question to sort of that longitudinal glance.
Hmm.
And something we also see with service design patterns is the co-opting of a model. And
Mm.
the example I'll give you here is Disney World. Disney World started off as we're going to provide people an ecosystem. An ecosystem is like Apple. You get into Apple, you can't get out of Apple. You are in Disney World, you cannot see the outside world of Disney World.
Hmm.
But then what they found is people stay for the service, the concierge service. I
Hmm.
stayed at Disney World because if I drop my popcorn, I know somebody will hand me a new bag within 5 minutes. And yet, yes, they get graded on that. That is an actual statistic.
It's dystopian. I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah,
but
yeah. Oh,
ooh.
it's fine. It's fine. But you also have these moments where I guess franchises get co-opted. I don't even know if that would be the right word, but do have you seen and how do you see sort of the demand of the audience co-opt and change the nature of a particular story?
Oof. Okay. Three big questions, one after the other after the other. This is awesome. First
Yes,
of all, I started humming Hotel California when you were like talking about Disneyland. It's like an ecosystem of
it
like you can
fits.
never leave. It's
Yeah,
so true.
yeah.
Um, but in terms of co-opting, so there are a couple of different ways I feel like this question can be answered. And again, it's not to say that any of them are universally positive or negative. Of course, it's a mixed bag in each case. Um, But this absolutely has me thinking about like fan service, right? Like we know there have been people who've been playing Dungeons and Dragons since the 70s and the 80s, and they played with a certain type of monster, they played with a certain type of stakes to the game. We have to have at least some nod to those people, or we're going to lose them as a customer base as we kind of update through, the newest editions. With Star Wars, like, okay, nowadays Leia in a bikini, choice we would not make, but you still have to do something for like the fans who grew up with that and who saw that as an unobjectionable part of the narrative of Star Wars, right? So, um, it can also like over an anime mean something a little different, but like this notion that fans and audiences come in expecting something from your media text, you have to give it to them because you're going to lose them otherwise. And if people who are more casual viewers are like, why did I get an upskirt shot? Why did I get this? Whatever. Well, deal with it because you're not the core fan. So
Right, right.
fan service is, yeah, and that's interesting to think about in terms of co-opting though, because usually you have those moments being made by the authorized producers who are like, I'm doing this for you. You're welcome, right? Um, but another way to think about co-opting also is that even to go back to the same question of like Leia in a bikini, right? Is Jabba slave? Like, so instead you like I General you, of course, Lucasfilm or Disney, I suppose at this point is like I cannot attract I cannot reliably attract the same types of audiences to my media text through this depiction of women. What do we have instead? So we have women in a different kind of role, different kind of outfit, different kind of place in the narrative. And then you'll have fans who grew up with Leia in a bikini, whatever, like that's co-opting, right? I came here expecting fan service, or I came here expecting more kind of narrative continuity, visual cohesion, and instead I got this. This is not an update to the franchise I wanted. You are not doing you may be authorized, but you're not doing the thing I want with the media text. So from this long block of text, you're like, I have lots of thoughts about this and no clear answers, right? There are tons of ways to think about it.
Let me rob from a previous discussion we've had because, we always talk about these beforehand. The audience knows I do my research.
Hmm.
And I'm going to use your Star Wars example because I grew up on Star Wars. I love Star Wars. If the new
Hmm.
movies had a heroine in a bikini, I'd be,
Hmm.
you're trying a little hard.
Hmm.
And I'm
Yeah.
remembering what you told me about Emergent Story because
Yes.
they did have the Millennium Falcon. And it was
Hmm.
used in a way that I kind of tripped and fell over it because it was organic. And I wept.
Okay.
So I was wondering if you could bring together that concept of the different types of story because there's emergent and what is the other one?
Oh, so those are emergent and embedded and narrative, and those
Yes.
come from game design. So over in game design, and this will be Salen and Zimmerman, I'm going to misquote the text, Principles of Game Design or something from 2006, I believe. But over in game design and game studies, they're writing about the difference between stories whose origin points are already built into the media text. Like you talk to this NPC, you follow this story path, you're going to get a certain quest. That certain quest is going to lead you to a bigger one, and you're going to get to a different ending of the video game story than you would have if you hadn't spoken to that NPC, right? So that being embedded narrative. With emergent narrative, you're talking about a more kind of open world concept, I guess, if we're going to be talking about games terms. Like the story emerges from the interaction of the players with the environment and with whatever assets they kind of have, right? Um, So yeah, it's we're in an interesting kind of moment with the increasing like overlap between different mediums, right? Where, as you're saying, we can kind of apply these things now to texts that are not games, to texts that are media franchises. Um, yeah, so right now this is more like a kind of transmedia storytelling moment. This notion that if you want to watch Star Wars now, right, you can't just go into the theaters and go see I want to say Andor, but that's not in theaters. You can't go and like watch Andor. You have to watch season one.
Right.
You have to have watched, but also you have to have watched texts in other mediums. Like you probably should have seen Rogue One, which is a movie instead of a TV show. You probably should have at least a little bit of familiarity with some of the video games so that you know who the NPCs in that game are now live action characters. Yeah, so you have the entire franchise as a kind of web, and you're supposed to kind of like bounce between the texts of different mediums. It's not so much just sequels and prequels in a linear fashion anymore.
So it's becoming a conceptual open world.
Yeah, that's
Awesome.
absolutely one way to think
I
about
love
that.
it.
But you also have that kind of transmedia storytelling moment going on at the same time that remakes and reboots and revivals are also happening. And sometimes in if the franchise is big enough, like Star Wars, you've got both of those things crossing over, like the multiplicity of media forms and a ton of different remakes, reboots. How do you fit them all in the same storyline? I don't know. That's someone else's job, not mine. But it's interesting to see those two things kind of like happening simultaneously.
Awesome. So we're talking about the nature of story and what gets retold and reinvented. And I know one thing you work on is looking at this through the lens of culture.
Hmm.
And I'm a big comic book geek at the end of the day, and something I always love is seeing a an issue that is prevalent in society show up in comic books, often beforehand.
Hmm.
So when we look at cultural transition, can you use almost this media to track an inflection point of culture has changed here in this way, and you have this evidence of franchise change, story change?
100%. And not only that, but I think that you can kind of trace that both ways. So for instance, there's one way is that you have the media itself inflecting on culture, right? So you have all kinds of documented stories about I want to say Whoopi Goldberg is one of them. Mae West is another, like black women watching Star Trek and being like, oh my God, Uhura. She is a valued member of the crew. There's space for me to exist in the world and in the US in
Yes.
this way, going on and being that change, right? So you have media and its impact on culture, but other way around, absolutely. And something we talked about before was like, can you backwards source kind of this, seeing like franchises started behaving in a different way at this point. What can we work backwards and see like what is going on in culture at the time and like look for what that influence was. Um, so I was really struck by that term and that idea when we talked about it. For me, one of the really interesting kinds of things about that is I think about the first Iron Man movie because at that point you hadn't real I mean you had successful superhero franchises before, not to the extent of what the Marvel Cinematic Universe was about to kick off and become, right?
Right.
So that's an inflection point. That's a cultural shift right there. Um, I'm still wondering about like what is that,
What made it
right?
stick at that point?
What made it stick, and
Yeah.
then what made it stick to the point that they're like, what that means is we need all of Marvel's properties to do
Yeah.
that, right?
Again, again, and again.
And
Yeah.
again, yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah.
let's get a little applied here. And that
Hmm.
repetition of again and again and again, it reminds me of
Hmm.
there's this data science concept called model drift.
Hmm.
And model drift is when you make a predictive model based upon things that are happening,
Hmm.
and you're making predictions, and you don't know those things have changed. And then your predictions get wildly more wrong over time forever.
Hmm. Hmm.
So if you have story that is based on a snapshot of culture, and people like to retell the story because we're going to play what works. Every hit song has the same beats. Every
Hmm.
story is a different variation on the hero ever since Robert Downey Jr. put on the mask.
Hmm. Hmm.
Do you have these points where the model has drifted and you snap your fingers and, oh, this story just doesn't land anymore?
Hmm. Hmm. It's really funny that you're using the snap your fingers. I'm like, the later Avengers movies did not land either culturally
Right.
or um culturally or culturally. I'll just say this. By the time the first event, we'll start with an example, and I'll give an example from like the audience side. I'll give an example that I saw from like the text side, and then kind of mull over what the hell's going on here. So after the first Avengers movie was released, you could not turn around on the Archive of Our Own, or AO3, which is the major fan fiction archive for English speakers. You could not turn around without seeing um, an Avengers fic, right? And there were a couple of different tropes that were really popular, like we're all a big happy family, we're rehabilitating Loki, we're doing all these things as a kind of collective, focusing on the space of Tony Stark's Avengers Tower, right?
Right.
There is no such trend following the later movies, right? So you had like that seemed to hit what its audience wanted. It had, seemed to have some kind of staying power um, in terms of like found family, rehabilitation, rehabilitative justice, etc. That again, I have not seen with any of the later Avengers movies or with the Loki TV shows. And the term I'm tempted to point toward is oversaturation and power creep. Like, so again, if you're getting an Avengers movie that's supposed to be world-shattering, universe-ending
Right.
stakes, every single Avengers movie, by the time you get to the five of them, you're like, no,
How do you
not
escalate
doing it.
forever? Yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And for a while, I thought maybe they could rescue that by like having some of the post Thanos stories being about like recovering people, right? But that's just not landing the same way. And you still have to, again, with our expectations of narrative, we're expecting another upswing. What in the world could possibly top the notion that half the population of the universe disappeared? Like, where do
Right.
you go after that? Where do you
Yeah.
go after that?
It's a good point.
Um, yeah, so I'm thinking of that, but an example within the text itself, um, someone will know the answer better than me. I remember one of the early MCU films had like, their post trailers teaser thing, like this is what's coming up. They had like a picture of like Howard the Duck. And I remember walking out of the theater and having like this teenage boy explaining in the most excited tones you can imagine who Howard the Duck was to his parents, who were just like, that looked like Donald Duck to me.
That's
Right.
fantastic.
But there was
Yeah.
genuine excitement from this kid to be like, I'm a purveyor of cultural, specialized, rarefied cultural knowledge to my parents, when normally it's the other way around, right? We've seen like two or three different citations of Howard the Duck since. Like one was in Guardians of the Galaxy, one was I think in like She-Hulk.
Yeah.
Nada, zip.
Nothing.
There's no
Weird.
interest anymore. So like
Yeah.
those like citation, those like Easter eggs, those drops of cultural knowledge, no longer hit the same because if, again, every single movie, every single story is trying to be clever and citational and self-referential about that web of stories in the same way, I want an actual story about Howard the Duck or get him out of there. What is he doing to be like just an Easter egg?
Yeah.
You get tired of that after a
You
while.
can't
So.
tell the same joke twice and have it land just as
A
well.
100%. And
Yeah.
when it's not even supposed to be a joke, but it's supposed to imply all the canon about Howard the Duck, what if I don't know that? What if I don't care
Right.
about that? What if I've seen this joke told three other times and there was no payoff then? Why do I care now? Right.
Right.
So to struggle and try to bring this full circle, um, I have fallen a bit off of MCU at this point, right? Like I'll watch all the Black Panther movies they care to make. Absolutely. I'm here for those. But um, I'm thinking of like a comparison between Tony Stark and one of the other brilliant, abrasive, whatever heroes they're filming now, like Doctor Strange. The stakes for Doctor Strange, how he finds himself, are so bound up in like cataclysmic, universe ending, it whatever. You don't have him ramping up those stakes, learning slowly. We just jump right on off the deep end. And one of
Right.
the more recent movies had like, Wanda involved. You had to have seen her TV show, whatever. So there's not really a chance, I feel like, for him to grow as a hero we care about, despite his abrasiveness, despite whatever, the way we did about Tony Stark.
Yeah.
The
That's asking people to
oversaturation.
side on to a lot from the very beginning.
100%.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah.
So, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, not just the story thing and the canon thing,
Mhm.
but your your passion and your knowledge of this field. When I am a project manager working on
Hmm.
software and I'm trying to describe what is being built or what I'm going to build,
Hmm.
and I put in my little ticket, they literally call that a user story.
Hmm.
We are trying to create a way somebody experiences a thing over time.
Hmm.
Experience is story, it's practically the same thing. Customer experience, customer story.
Hmm.
So when we're talking about the nature of story, where do you see the field going? What's going to be new? Because a lot of this will transfer over.
Hmm. Hmm. Honestly, and I'm gonna throw some terms in here, they're probably already gonna be familiar to folks because they're so prevalent across different fields right now. There's an interest in stories being experiential and immersive. In other words, how do you and interactive. Let's throw three out there: experiential, immersive, and interactive. Um, how do you get people as invested as possible so that they are throwing time, energy, money, etc. into these? Um, and again, a lot of this perspective is because I'm interested in franchises. I'm really interested in seeing the turn toward games, right?
Right.
So we need to have a Doctor Who board game. We need to have games in all these different medias to amplify the experience of simply watching the text, right? How do we bring and immerse folks into the experience of this? You don't just turn off the TV after Who. Now go play, right? Now go.
Like
And
it.
this is, yeah, by itself, this is not at all a new phenomenon. Like novelizations have existed since the early 1900s, right? We've had those. But walking past a novelization on a Target shelf or the checkout line or wherever that might be is really different from being able to say, I went and I participated in the story as well as having watched it. What's really interesting to me is that one of the earliest uses I have found of this use of canon was Lucasfilm producers talking about Star Wars video games, where they were like, yes, in the movies, it's Luke who goes and, has this pivotal moment of shooting off that missile and destroying the Death Star. Well, if you play these video games, you could be the one who shoots that missile, and you could be the one who destroys the Death Star,
I like
right?
that. Yeah.
Yeah, so like the gospel, the canon is the movies where you have this specific hero taking on this specific narrative role and turning the story this way. But in the games, you can change that story. It could not
Right.
happen at all. Yeah,
Right. I
that was
like that
really
a
interesting
lot.
to me.
Okay, so every profession I've seen, been around, had a touch
Hmm.
point with, talks about storytelling at large. A data scientist needs to know how to storytell with their charts.
Hmm.
A lawyer needs to know how to storytell to make the jury appreciate the context of the thing.
Hmm.
We're all talking about storytelling and how we use it and getting better at it. Why is this so hard, and what would you point people to get better?
Oh my gosh. Okay. So honestly, I feel like this answer is coming more from like my rhetoric and writing training, but
Totally.
not to oversimplify so much. This is all about audience, right? If you come in knowing my audience cares about this genre, my audience has these preconceived notions, my audience has these values, has these beliefs, you could be telling like the broad sketches of the same story about heroism, about whatever that you would tell to a skeptical audience, but you can tailor it because you can leave out certain parts, you can play up certain parts because you know what your audience is already primed to hear, right? So I could go the technical route and say, oh, you want a beginning, a middle, and end, you want clear stakes, you want a kind of an upswing and then a denouement. That's the technical side. Know your audience, right? And again, not to be a shill for any franchises, but I feel like that's where some of them have gone off the tracks a little bit. They don't know who their
Right.
audience is anymore. They're expecting, my audience has done the homework of watching a backlog of 15 years of movies and every property. That's not their audience anymore, right? So
Right.
it's
That's
interesting
true.
to
Yeah.
see. Yeah.
Okay, so to wrap this up with our final question, we've talked a lot about what is truth. And I
Hmm.
always like to end with a note of what got somebody into the thing and the path that they're on. What
Hmm.
is that story, that franchise, that experience you had at the very beginning when you sat back at the end and said, "Wow, this just it rings true. I accept this." Yes, Bilbo
Okay.
went to the mountain. Yeah,
Mm, 100%. It it very much was the Lord of the Rings. It was sitting there, and I think I remember finishing it on like a rainy day, and I was just like, well, that did not have the tidy, happily ever after ending that I had come to expect from
right.
like children's media written in the 80s and 90s, that was my fare until then. I was like, that poor Frodo. Sam, no, I don't I don't know if I like this. Something about it rings very true, but also
Right.
no. Um, so looking that definitely that was a foundational text for me. Another was
Outstanding.
Isaac Asimov's like robot series. Again, I don't want this to be true that there's such a disconnect between humans and labor, but that rings very true to like the difference between
Yeah.
humans as consumers and humans as who are laboring, you know?
Yeah.
I don't like it. I hate it. This is uncomfortable, but
It feels true. Yeah.
it feels true. So that's the like the answer to your question, but also I find it really interesting and telling that even here in this conversation, you and I are slipping into this particular verbiage, which is feels true, because to me, that's a really interesting kind of connection between emotion and affect and feeling something. If you feel it deeply and purely enough, isn't it true? And that's really exploitable that I'm just
I
like, we're in
yeah.
that moment.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
I like that
Yeah.
as a thing to be pointed out. Okay,
Hmm.
so thank you so much, Maria. Here at
Hmm.
Ishmael Interactive, we always like to end our discussion with what we call the one for fun. And the intent is to be a little goofy, a little unique, and ask something that is going to help people remember, oh, this is the conversation that ended with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for some reason. Let's be weird.
Uh-huh.
Now, we've talked a bit about different stories and conversations and what it is to really buy in. I'm
Hmm.
also a huge fan of comedy, and my favorite type of comedian is somebody who commits to the bit. They do things with their whole heart. What is something mundane that you commit to the bit? You take it seriously because this is something you want to be all in on.
Honestly, it's during conversations with like family and friends. If it's a story about an inconvenience, play it up. Like it's not just a paper cut, it's you chopped off your finger. And if there's a goofy voice to go along with it, if there's a flop against the couch to go along with it, do it.
I love
Commit
it.
to the bit.
I
Yeah.
love it. Excellent. Thank you so much. From here at Ishmael Interactive, have a good day.